young anatomists, these are our drawing notes for blood cell structure and function. The goal here is to take all of the information that we need to know about blood, put it in one easy to manage format, and really take control of that information. So let's get started. First, I think it's important to establish what exactly is blood here, and what better color to use to talk about that than red. So you could divide blood up into two basic components. The first component is the cellular component. Blood is composed of about 45% cells, and those blood cells are called red blood cells, or RBCs. And red blood cells, they're really well known for their job in transporting oxygen, but they also help in transporting carbon dioxide as well. Then, of course, there are white blood cells, or WBCs, and there are platelets as well. Now, technically, platelets aren't cells. They're called formed elements of blood, but we're going to put them in the cellular component here. The other part of blood is called the plasma. So the other 55% of blood is the plasma. And what's in plasma? Well, plasma is mostly water, but also you can find proteins in plasma. And an example of proteins would be like clotting factors. Clotting is when your blood kind of coagulates or forms clumps to stop bleeding from happening. We'll talk more about that later. Other components of plasma are electrolytes. And electrolytes are ions, so ions like sodium and potassium. You remember those from the nervous system unit, and calcium. Those are some good blood electrolytes. And then nutrients travel around in the plasma component. A famous one from our last unit is glucose, and amino acids, the protein building blocks, travel around in the plasma as nutrients as well. And then we have wastes. The easiest waste to think about when we're thinking about the blood is carbon dioxide. And urea is another waste as well that we'll get into in a couple of chapters from now. Hormones, we said, travel throughout the blood in our endocrine chapter. And then something that people don't think about a lot is body heat. So remember how your blood can be diverted in different ways. Different blood vessels can vasodilate or vasoconstrict to send body heat around. Now, when people think about blood, one of the important things that people think about is blood circulation. So let's tackle that in the middle here. Blood circulation. And when your blood circulates around, you can consider that kind of like two circulation loops. One of those is called the pulmonary circulation. And pulmonary, whenever you see that word, that's going to have to do with your lungs. And the other is called the systemic circulation. So how blood gets to all of your body systems, all of the rest of your systems and tissues are covered by systemic circulation. And this is a good chance for us to kind of introduce some concepts that will be reinforced a little bit later on. Now, anatomically correct here, right in the middle of this drawing, of course, is the heart. So let's draw that in. Of course, your heart doesn't look like this. And the heart has four chambers to it. The atria and the ventricles. Now, when we draw this on here, we've got the left atrium and the left ventricle, and that looks a little bit weird. And you might be saying like, well, this is on the right side of my paper, but we're thinking about the person. And if we're looking at the person, our right side is their left side. And then I'm going to draw this in blue over here, and there'll be a reason for that later on. The right atrium and the right ventricle. So if we start in the heart, when blood leaves your heart blood leaves your heart in a big blood vessel that hooks up to the left ventricle called the aorta. That's the biggest artery in your body. And then the aorta hooks up to other arteries. And the thing about arteries is arteries always carry blood away from your heart. So you can remember arteries, A in arteries, and A for away. So let's draw in these blood vessels right here, and we'll draw some arrows because our blood is going this way, away from the heart in those arteries. And the arteries are like the superhighways of our blood vessels. And then when you get off the highway, you still get onto some major streets, and those would be blood vessels called arterioles. So arterioles kind of means like little arteries, like that. When you break down the word, that's what that means. And then now this down here is representing all of our tissue cells. Tissue cells. And then the arterial blood vessels, which are small-ish, get really, really tiny and make these like networks in your tissue cells. So I'm just gonna draw them in, kind of like some spaghetti here. And those teeny tiny blood vessels are called capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels, and blood cells actually pass through capillaries like a single file line through there. Now, what happens in the capillaries is this is where your red blood cells will drop off that oxygen. And your blood switches from being considered oxygenated. That's why I drew it in red over here. And it goes to be where it's considered deoxygenated. I'm going to draw that in like this. Deoxygenated. And still, of course, your blood does have oxygen in it, but just not as much as before that oxygen gets dropped off. And the other important thing that your blood does, and your red blood cells are part of this, and then there are some other chemical reactions in the blood as well, is that the blood picks up carbon dioxide, CO2, as a waste product from the tissue cells. And that happens in the capillaries as well. Now, the superhighways that are used to take blood back to the heart are veins. But capillaries don't connect directly to veins. There are smaller branches of veins called venules. And veins, if arteries always take blood away, veins always take blood to the heart. So our blood is going from capillaries to venules to veins, all the way back to the heart, and dumping into the right atrium. Now, this big blood vessel, so we've got the aorta, is the major blood vessel taking blood away from the heart. The major blood vessel taking blood to the heart is called the Vena Cava. Vena Cava. And there's a superior Vena Cava that handles everything above your heart, and there's an inferior Vena Cava that handles bringing blood back from everywhere below your heart. All right, so then that blood passes from your right atrium to your right ventricle, and then that blood needs to get charged back up. So it leaves the right ventricle and travels to the lungs. So we'll draw some arrows here, showing blood leaving the heart. And the big blood vessel that leaves your heart towards your lungs is pulmonary. There's our lung word. And since blood is moving away from the heart, pulmonary artery. Arteries taking away from the heart. And then we get to the lungs right here. So these are going to be our lung capillaries. So let's draw those capillaries in here as our teeny tiny blood vessels. And of course, the pulmonary artery doesn't connect to the capillaries by itself. Capillaries. But instead uses arterioles. So we go artery to arterioles to capillaries. And now we're at the lungs. So let's draw in that. This is the lungs. And at the lungs, the carbon dioxide gets dropped off. And you will exhale that carbon dioxide, but when you take a deep breath in, the goal is to bring in some oxygen and turn that deoxygenated blood back into oxygenated blood. Now, we've got to get that oxygenated blood back to the heart to deliver that oxygen through the whole body. And hopefully you can imagine bringing blood back to the heart. Those capillaries will merge with venules, and those venules will merge into veins. And our main one, bringing blood back to the left atrium of the heart, is the pulmonary veins. And now we've completed one circuit throughout the whole body. First, taking blood from the heart to the systemic circulation, dropping off oxygen, picking up carbon dioxide, and going back to the heart with veins. Then going through pulmonary circulation to take the blood to the heart, get recharged with oxygen, and bring that blood, take that blood from the heart to the lungs to get recharged with oxygen, and then bring that blood back to the heart to take that oxygen through the whole rest of the system. Now, of course, that gas exchange part, dropping off oxygen and picking up carbon dioxide in the tissue cells, dropping off carbon dioxide, picking up oxygen in the lungs, that gas exchange is a big job of red blood cells. But all of the blood cells in the platelets and the plasma all take this route around the body. Now, speaking of red blood cells, I want to take this space right here to talk about red blood cell homeostasis. So let's box this area off. Red blood cell homeostasis. And this process of making red blood cells is called erythropoiesis. It's a really weird word to spell and to say. Say it now, at least in your mind, or out loud. What the heck? Let's go for it. Erythropoiesis. And that's because red blood cells are called erythrocytes. That's their fancy name. Now, one thing that's crazy about red blood cells is that 2 million red blood cells die, and of course, like to replace those, are made per second. That's pretty crazy. So in the time to write that, probably 10, 20 million red blood cells died and were made. And just like any homeostatic loop, we've got our 6 main components here. So let's go ahead and draw those in. Set up our homeostatic loop down here. Draw a couple of boxes. Shoot, I hope I made that one big enough. Anyway, so our components are going to be set point. We remember this. Then we've got our stimulus. In erythropoiesis, the receptor and control center are considered the same thing. So receptors and control center. The control center has to communicate with the effectors. And then, of course, that causes the response of returning back to the set point. Now, in this case, our stimulus isn't like low red blood cells, but actually has to do with what red blood cells do. So the stimulus is going to be a decrease in blood oxygen. Decrease in blood O2. And our set point, I guess we could put that on here. And since we have a lot of medically minded folks in the classroom, there is, when you do blood tests, one of the important stats about your blood is called the Hematocrit. Hematocrit is like what percentage of your blood is like the red part, the cellular part. And so our set point for hematocrit is 40 to 50%. So that's our ideal amount of red blood cells in our blood. So the stimulus is when blood oxygen level decreases too low. And of course, that means our response is going to be to increase that blood oxygen level back to normal. And we use some body parts to help get there. First, the receptors and control center are the kidneys and the liver. And the kidneys and the liver, when they detect that blood oxygen levels are too low, they have to signal to the effector, and they use a hormone. So that hormone is called erythro. That means we're dealing with red blood cells. Erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is the name of that hormone, and that's kind of like a pain to say and a pain to spell. And so to make that easier, sometimes it's abbreviated as EPO. So you can call it either one. And erythropoietin is released by the kidneys and liver to signal to the effectors of our red bone marrow. Oh, this is going in the Wayback Machine for our skeletal system unit when we saw red bone marrow last, especially in the spongy bone of adults. And what the red bone marrow does in response to receiving that erythropoietin signal is to make more red blood cells. Makes more red blood cells. So that's the site of erythropoiesis, is your red bone marrow. And then once there are more red blood cells, that's going to lead to increased blood oxygen because there's more red blood cells to hold that oxygen. And then one cool thing about this is that there is some negative feedback with that blood oxygen. So the kidneys and liver can detect that blood oxygen level. So this is negative feedback. Right, or the product or goal of this process actually like feeds back to like shut down production. And so once blood oxygen levels are high enough, kidneys and liver will detect that, will stop releasing erythropoietin to slow down making more red blood cells. All right, so this is the important homeostatic loop from this chapter about blood. And now I want to get to a little bit more about these three types of blood cells or formed elements here. And let's talk a little bit about their physiological functions. And so we'll divide up this last column over here to talk about red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. All right, let's box out this area. And talk about red blood cells, so RBC. And I want to talk a little bit about their anatomy because red blood cells are some really cool and specialized cells, and their specialized anatomy, their specialized structures really fits their specialized function. And so we call that form follows function. So what exactly does a red blood cell look like? Well, it kind of looks a little bit like a donut. So if we were looking at a top view of a red blood cell, they are disc shaped, and the middle is kind of like pressed in. So it's not like a donut, like there's a hole in there, but it is pressed in. And I think like the better way to think about that is if we drew like a side view as well. So if we took this and we flipped it on its side, how it would look is there'd be like a fat part on the outside, and then it would get kind of really skinny in the middle before getting fat again on the outside. And it's kind of like smushed in on these sides. And that shape, it's a disc shape, but having those depressions on both sides is called a biconcave disc. So in physics, you might know that concave is like when things are pushed in, and convex is when things are pushed out. This is called biconcave because it's pushed in on both sides. So how does this anatomical specialization connect to the physiological function of red blood cells? Well, having this biconcave disc shape creates more surface area, on the red blood cell. And why is that important? That's really important for gas exchange. So oxygen and carbon dioxide have to pass back and forth in between the red blood cells through the membrane. And by having more membrane than if it was just flat or spherical, that allows red blood cells to be more efficient at gas exchange. And also this shape of having the biconcave disc allows red blood cells to be more bendy, more flexible. I probably should have put flexible, but I went with bendy instead. All right, so red blood cells are more bendy or more flexible to help the red blood cells squeeze through capillaries. Remember, capillaries are the smallest type of blood vessels where red blood cells can barely fit through single file in some cases. Now, another specialization of red blood cells is that red blood cells have no nucleus. They're anucleate. That's what it's called. No nucleus and no organelles. So after red blood cells are mature, they're not going to have mitochondria, they're not going to have a nucleus, no endoplasmic reticulum, none of that stuff. And the reason why this is good is because this creates more space. So more space inside a red blood cell to pack with hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is the important protein inside of red blood cells that contains iron that helps red blood cells carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. So that's worth putting on here. All right, so hemoglobin is a protein, hemoglobin protein to carry oxygen. So hemoglobin is really good at carrying oxygen, less good at carrying carbon dioxide, but can still carry some carbon dioxide. All right, so those are some important things to know about red blood cell anatomy, form follows function. And let's scooch down and use this section to think about some white blood cells. I'd write it in white, but we wouldn't be able to see it, right? All right, so white blood cells. We could have like a whole class or a whole unit just on white blood cells. So this is going to be just the basics. So physiologically, you can think about white blood cells as being involved in immune functions. And we've got like 6 different types of white blood cells that we need to keep track of. So I think the easiest ones to remember are called T cells, or T lymphocytes is their professional name, and B cells, or B lymphocytes. We'll learn more about those in the lymphatic system. B cells are super famous because they are cells that make antibodies. And antibodies are little proteins that circulate around the body that can attach to invaders like bacteria or viruses or things like that, and help those bad guys be detected by our other immune cells. All right, next we've got cells called macrophages and neutrophils and Eosinophils. And these, these cells, I like to find information in these anatomy words that can help us understand what they do. And the only one in here with some information is macrophage, and that means like a big eater. And so all of these cells have similar jobs. So what they do is they eat pathogens. So a pathogen is just like any bad guy that can infect us. So like a virus or a bacteria or an infected cell, these three types of white blood cells will take care of that. And then also dead cells. So each of our cells in our body has like a normal life cycle. And when the cell dies or gets damaged, these are kind of like the cleaners. Our last type is called basophils. Now, all of these white blood cells that have "phil" at the end, they're named just based on how they stain, like what type of stains allow you to see those. So these are neutral stains, so neutral lovers. Eosin is another type of stain. Eosin lovers, and basic, like pH basic stain lovers. But anyway, basophils, they release molecules called heparins, and heparin is an anticoagulant. So that keeps your blood from clotting, anticoagulant. I think I spelled that right. And basophils also release histamines. And I don't know about you, but when it comes to springtime and all of that pollen gets in the air, I gotta take some antihistamines, because these antihistamines, they are pro-inflammatory. So they're what will cause your eyes to water, and you get all sneezy and your nose gets drippy, and sometimes it can be hard to breathe with those histamines being released. Last but certainly not least, in our consideration of cells in formed units in the blood, are the platelets. And platelets' main function is called hemostasis. Oh man, that looks a lot like homeostasis, right? But hemostasis, this hemo part, has to do with blood, right? And stasis, of course, is like stable or keeping things even. And so what that means is that platelets are involved in kind of like keeping us from bleeding out. And so what happens is after there's an injury to a blood vessel, so whoops, I combined after an injury there. So after injury, platelets form a platelet plug. On the broken blood vessel, or on the injured blood vessel. Broken blood vessel. And what this does is it helps to stop bleeding. Right, so it's keeping your blood stable in your body by keeping that blood from kind of like leaking out, whether that's outside of your body or into like cavities in your body if there's internal bleeding. And then what happens is this platelet plug is kind of like the first step. And then what happens after that is that other proteins, the main one is called fibrin. So other proteins and cells stick together to this to make a clot. All right, so a platelet plug and a clot are slightly different things. Platelet plug is stronger and will stick around longer. And then that clot, of course, like if it's exposed to the air, will turn into like a scab, and then you can, keep picking it off and it becomes really itchy and everything. All right, so we're all set here. Hopefully you've learned a lot, and now this is all that we have to really know about blood. We've taken control of and organized the information, and hopefully this is something that will be a valuable study tool for you.